Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful for You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The opulent silence of the Forrester mansion was a fragile thing, a thin veneer of calm stretched over a chasm of unspoken truths and simmering resentments. In the grand living room, where the very air smelled of old money and fresh-cut calla lilies, Ridge Forrester stood like a statue carved from anguish and entitlement. Across from him, Brooke Logan, the woman who had been the tempestuous constant in his life for decades, held her ground, her eyes, usually pools of gentle blue compassion, now hardened with a resolve that seemed to have been forged in a fire he knew nothing about. They had been here 1,000 times before, on this precipice of heartbreak and accusation, the familiar dance of Logan's versus Forrester's playing its tired melody. He had come to confront her about yet another perceived betrayal, his voice a low, thunderous roll of frustration, accusing her of siding with their son, Thomas, of not understanding the sacred duty of protecting the Forrester legacy, the name, the bloodline. But this time, something was different. This time, the weary sadness in Brooke's posture was not that of a wounded wife, but of a guardian at the end of her long vigil. The accusations that usually made her crumble or fight back with fiery tears now seemed to bounce off a newfound, unshakable fortitude. "You think this is about taking sides, Ridge?" she said, her voice unnervingly calm, a stark contrast to his storm. "You think this is about me, or Thomas, or even you? You stand there, in this house built on your father's name, talking about legacy and blood as if you are the sole keeper of the flame. But you have no idea, do you? You have no idea what that name truly cost. What it was built upon." Ridge scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that had once had the power to shatter her. "Don't, Brooke. Don't try to twist this. My father, Eric, built this empire from nothing. He instilled in us what it means to be a Forrester. It's about honor, integrity, family. Something you Logans have always been desperate to be a part of but never truly understood." He spat the word Logans like a curse, a habit he'd never broken. A sad, almost pitying smile touched Brooke's lips. It was that smile, so foreign and unsettling, that finally gave him pause. "Honor? Integrity," she repeated softly, her gaze drifting towards the massive portrait of Eric Forrester that dominated the room, his painted eyes forever kind, forever wise. "Eric was a great man, Ridge. The best man I've ever known. But even great men have secrets. Even the strongest foundations have cracks that run deep into the earth, cracks that can split wide open and swallow everything you thought you knew." She took a step closer, her presence suddenly filling the room, commanding an attention she had never before demanded. "For 30 years, I have carried a secret. A secret Eric entrusted to me on his deathbed, a burden he asked me to bear to protect this family, to protect you. But I can't do it anymore. Your self-righteousness, your constant judgment, your belief that Forrester blood is some kind of royal elixir, it has to end. Today." Ridge felt a cold tendril of dread snake its way up his spine. This was not the Brooke he knew. This was not about a stolen design or a whispered rumor. This was something monumental, something that was shifting the very ground beneath his Italian leather loafers. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing some of its thunder, replaced by a wary confusion. "What secret?" Brooke's eyes met his, and in their blue depths, he saw the ghost of his father, and the weight of 3 decades of silence. "It's about your mother," she said, and the words hung in the air, cold and heavy. "It's about Stephanie." "Don't you dare speak about my mother," Ridge growled, his fists clenching. Stephanie Forrester was his North Star, the indomitable matriarch whose love and iron will had shaped him. Her memory was sacrosanct. "I have to, Ridge. Because the story you know, the story of your birth, of being the firstborn son of Eric and Stephanie Forrester, the golden heir, it's a lie." Brooke drew a shaky breath, the weight of her confession visibly pressing down on her. Stephanie couldn't have children. The doctors were very clear. It was a source of immense pain and shame for her, a private agony she and Eric bore alone in those early years of their marriage. They were desperate for a family, for an heir. And so, they made an arrangement. Ridge stared, uncomprehending. An arrangement? What does that mean? It means, Brooke said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every syllable ringing with crystalline clarity in the vast room, that Stephanie is not your biological mother. The world seemed to slow, the colors in the room bleeding into a muted, gray haze. Ridge heard the words, but they were nonsense, syllables strung together that formed a meaning his brain refused to process. That's insane, he choked out. A vicious lie. Why would you say that? Because it's the truth. Brooke insisted, her own tears beginning to well, not of weakness, but of a long-suppressed catharsis. They found a young woman, someone from a good family who needed financial help. It was all done discreetly, privately. Eric, he was the biological father. The woman carried the child, his child, and gave him up at birth to Eric and Stephanie. They brought you home, and the world saw the perfect Forrester family. Stephanie loved you with every fiber of her being, Ridge. She was your mother in every way that truly mattered. But biologically, she was not. Ridge staggered back as if physically struck, his hand flying to his chest where a sharp, stabbing pain had taken root. The air left his lungs in a rush. The portrait of his father seemed to mock him now. All his life, he had defined himself by that bloodline. His arrogance, his talent, his very identity as Ridge Forrester was built upon the premise of being the direct, biological descendant of Eric Forrester, born by the formidable Stephanie. To have one of those pillars ripped away felt like a limb being torn from his body. Who, he rasped, his voice broken. Who was she? The woman? And then, Brooke delivered the second, far more devastating blow. She looked at him not with pity, but with a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. It was years later, she began, the story unfolding like a tragic novel. After you were born, after the secret was buried. Eric, in his grief and his own way of trying to fill the void, had a brief, passionate affair. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness that produced a child. A daughter. He provided for her from afar, but he could never acknowledge her, not with the secret of your own birth already hanging over the family. He loved Stephanie, and he couldn't destroy her with another betrayal. That daughter grew up. She fell in love. And she had a child of her own. Brooke paused, letting the horrifying, inevitable logic of her story begin to dawn on him. Ridge's mind, reeling from the first revelation, scrambled to follow the thread, to find the connection. He saw Brooke's eyes, and in them, he saw the answer before she even spoke it. He saw a lifetime of her defending hope, of her fierce, almost irrational devotion to their daughter. He remembered the whispers, the strange sense that Brooke's connection to hope was different, deeper, more primal than her bond with her other children. The pieces, jagged and terrifying, began to click into place. No, he whispered, a plea, a denial. Brooke, no. Hope is not my daughter, Ridge, Brooke said, the confession leaving her in a torrent of relieved agony. She is Eric's granddaughter. Her mother was Eric's biological daughter. Hope's middle name, Logan, was my name, but her blood is Forrester. Pure Forrester. The only one of our children who carries Eric's direct, unbroken, biological lineage. Hope is the real Forrester. The impact of those words, Hope is the real Forrester, struck Ridge with the force of a physical blow. It was as if the universe had tilted on its axis, reversing the poles of his entire existence. All the times he had favored Steffi, his firstborn, the one who so clearly embodied the Forrester spirit, over Hope, the good girl with the Logan heart. All the times he had dismissed Hope's designs as sweet but lacking the edge, the fire of a true Forrester. All the times he had upheld Steffi as the standard-bearer of the dynasty, the true heir to the throne. It had all been a colossal, cruel joke. The daughter he had consistently underestimated, the one he had seen as secondary, was, by the very bloodline dogma he worshipped, the legitimate heir. She was Eric's direct descendant. She was, in the most literal, genetic sense he had always valued above all else, the real thing. And he, Ridge, was the one built on the foundation of a carefully constructed lie. A sound escaped his lips, a raw, guttural sob that was torn from the deepest, most vulnerable part of his soul. The tears he had fought so hard to control, the tears of a man who prided himself on his strength, burst forth in an uncontrollable flood. They were not gentle tears of sadness, but great, heaving sobs of utter devastation. He collapsed into a nearby armchair, his broad shoulders shaking, his face buried in his hands. He was crying for the mother he thought he had, for the identity that had just been ripped away, for the father whose honor was now tarnished by a lifetime of deceit. He was crying for the years of unfairness towards Hope, his own daughter, who was more his father's child than he himself was. He was crying for the sheer, overwhelming collapse of his entire world. The legacy was a sham. The bloodline was a fiction, at least where it concerned him. The name Forrester that he had worn like a crown was, in the most fundamental way, not his to claim in the manner he always had. Brooke watched him, her own tears falling silently. She did not go to him, knowing this was a pain she could not comfort. This was a journey through a personal hell that he had to navigate alone. She had carried the secret for Eric, for the family, and now she had finally set it free, watching as it detonated the life of the man she loved. The silence of the room was now filled with the heartbreaking sound of Ridge Forrester's complete and total breakdown, the sound of a king discovering his throne was made of sand, the sound of a son learning he was not his father's son in the way that mattered most to him, and the sound of a father realizing he had failed his own child on a cosmic, unforgivable scale. The revelation was out, and nothing, not Forrester creations, not their marriage, not Ridge's very sense of self, would ever be the same again. Hope was the sun, and Ridge's entire world had just been plunged into an eclipse of his own making. The sobs that racked Ridge's body were not merely tears, they were the seismic aftershocks of a personal apocalypse. Each gasp for air was a futile attempt to inflate a collapsed identity. The grand, ornate living room of the mansion, a space that had always been a testament to his birthright, now felt like a gilded cage, the walls closing in, the portrait of Eric Forrester no longer a symbol of paternal pride but a monument to a foundational lie. He could feel Brooke's gaze upon him, a mixture of profound pity and exhausted resolve, but he could not meet her eyes. To look at her would be to acknowledge the truth, and his entire being was revolting against it, fighting a desperate, losing battle against the tectonic shift of reality. His mind, a whirling vortex of denial and anguish, began to project the ghosts of 1,000 moments, each one now horribly, irrevocably recontextualized. He saw his mother, Stephanie, her fierce, proud eyes, the steel in her voice when she would say, "You are a Forrester, Ridge. Never forget what that means." He had worn that like a suit of armor. Now, he wondered what private pain lay behind those words, what secret fear that her beloved son, the cornerstone of her life's work, was not of her body. He remembered her sometimes unyielding, almost frantic devotion to him, a devotion that now seemed less like natural maternal instinct and more like a fortress built to protect a precious, stolen treasure. Had she lived every day in fear of this moment? Had her iron will been, in part, a desperate performance to convince the world, and perhaps herself, of a truth that did not exist? And Eric. His father. His hero. The man whose approval had been the sun around which his life orbited. The memories of sitting in his office, learning about fabrics and designs, of Eric clapping a hand on his shoulder and saying, "You have the gift, son. It's in your blood." That phrase, "in your blood," now echoed with a cruel, mocking irony. What blood? The blood of a stranger? The biological connection was there, yes, but it was tainted, shrouded in the secrecy of a transaction, a desperate solution to a social shame. The sacred Forrester legacy, the very thing he had fought Thomas over, had nearly destroyed his marriage for, had been a carefully curated performance from its very inception. He, Ridge Forrester, the standard-bearer, was the living, breathing proof of its falsity. But the most piercing pain, the one that cut deeper than any other, was the memory of Hope. His daughter. His daughter. The quiet one, the one who always seemed to embody her mother's so-called Logan sentimentality, the one he had consistently, systematically, placed second. He saw her face, so full of a gentle, earnest light, a light he had often dismissed as a lack of the necessary Forrester fire. He remembered pushing her designs aside for Steffi's more provocative, edgy collections. He heard his own voice, time and again, telling Brooke, "Steffi understands the business, Brooke. She has the killer instinct. Hope, she's sweet, but this is a battlefield." Every time he had chosen Steffi, every time he had validated her as the true heir in his mind, he had been upholding a lie and denigrating the truth. Hope, with her unwavering integrity, her innate grace, her genuine love for the heritage of the company, she was everything Eric had ever preached about what it meant to be a Forrester. She was the living embodiment of Eric's spirit, not in the arrogant, domineering way Ridge had interpreted it, but in its purest, most authentic form. And he had been blind to it. He had favored the daughter who reflected his own performative, flawed understanding of legacy over the one who actually carried its genetic and moral blueprint. A fresh wave of tears, these hot with shame, streamed down his face. He thought of the recent battles over hope for the future, the line Eric had created for her. He had seen it as his father's sentimental folly, a pet project for Brooke's daughter. Now, he understood. Eric hadn't just been indulging a granddaughter-in-law. He had been, in the only way he could, acknowledging his own blood. He had been trying to guide his true heir, to instill in her the values of the company that was rightfully hers by a lineage Ridge could never claim. The line wasn't a side project, it was a birthright. And Ridge had fought against it. He had become the very obstacle to his own father's dying wish, the gatekeeper of a legacy that was never truly his to gatekeep. All this time, the words were a ragged whisper, torn from his throat. He finally lifted his head, his vision blurred, his face a mess of anguish. He looked at Brooke, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not the scheming Logan he had so often accused her of being, but a woman who had carried an unbearable burden. All this time, you knew. You knew what she was. What I wasn't. Brooke's own composure was fragile, but her voice was steady. I knew that the man you worshipped, the father you put on a pedestal, was human. He made a terrible mistake with the affair that produced Hope's mother, and he lived with that guilt every day. He loved Stephanie, and he loved you, Ridge. So much. But the secret of your birth, and the secret of his infidelity, they were cancers eating him alive. On his deathbed, he made me swear. He said, "Brooke, you must protect them. You must protect the family. The truth will only destroy everything." He was trying to protect you, most of all. He knew how much your identity was tied to that name. Protect me? Ridge let out a bitter, choked laugh. He lied to me. My entire life has been a lie, built on a lie. And you were complicit. For 30 years, Brooke. You watched me strut around like the crown prince, you watched me favor Steffi, you watched me break Hope's heart over and over again with my indifference, and you said nothing. The anger was a welcome heat, a temporary antidote to the freezing cold of his despair. And what would you have had me do, Ridge? Brooke fired back, her own pain finally breaking through. Shatter you? Shatter Stephanie's memory? For what? So you could have this existential crisis sooner? Eric believed, and I came to believe, that the love was what was real. The family you built was what was real. The blood in your veins didn't make Stephanie any less your mother. It didn't make Eric any less your father. They loved you. I love you. But you with your Forrester this and Forrester that, you made it all about the blood. You created this hierarchy, this tyranny of a name. You forced this reckoning, Ridge. Your own arrogance, your own judgment, left me no choice. Her words landed like hammer blows, each one striking a devastating truth. She was right. He had built the prison himself. He was the one who had turned the Forrester name into a weapon, a measure of absolute value. He had created a world where this revelation would be cataclysmic. If he had valued character over chromosomes, if he had seen the legacy as one of action and love rather than simple biology, this truth would have been a footnote, a curious piece of family history. Instead, it was an extinction-level event. His mind raced to the future, to the implications that stretched out like a dark, terrifying road. Steffi. How would his fierce, proud daughter react? The one who had basked in the certainty of her position as the true Forrester heir apparent. To learn that her main rival, her half-sister, was not just a rival, but in the one way that mattered to their father, her superior? It would break her. It would shatter the dynamic of their entire family. Thomas, his son, who had his own twisted, obsessive relationship with the Forrester legacy and with hope. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Thomas, who saw hope as someone to be possessed, to be molded into the perfect Forrester wife, would now have to confront the fact that she was more a Forrester than he was. The scandal would be nuclear. It wouldn't just be a family secret, it would be a media frenzy that could destabilize the entire company. Forrester heir illegitimate, Hope Logan true founder's granddaughter. The headlines wrote themselves in his mind, each one a public flaying.